by Narratives presents Burt Ploughshare and the Zombie Rabbit Outbreak. We hope you'll sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Burt Ploughshare was once again hard at work on his humble farm, the sweat beading on his brow as he labored under the hot sun. The soil was stubborn and unyielding, but Burt was determined to till every last inch of his land. As he toiled away, Skully, the ancient skull of a powerful necromancer, looked on with a mix of amusement and frustration. Skully was bound to Burt by an accidental spell, and though he held the farmer in low regard, he had no choice but to stay by his side and help him on his bizarre adventures. On this particular day, Skully decided that some light-hearted entertainment was in order. To alleviate his own boredom and to test Burt's gullibility, he floated alongside the farmer, a mischievous grin playing on his bony features. "Burt, I've just recalled an incantation that can make your work much easier," Skully began, trying to sound sincere. "Imagine, with a simple spell, you can multiply the fruits of your labor, without the back-breaking work." Burt, who had been wiping the sweat from his brow, looked over at Skully with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. He had learned the hard way that Skully's intentions were rarely benevolent. "What's the catch, Skully?" he asked cautiously. "Oh, Burt," Skully replied, feigning innocence. "Why must you always assume the worst? I simply wish to assist you in your toils." His tone was dripping with sarcasm, though it went over Burt's head. Burt considered Skully's offer, his desire for an easier life warring with his mistrust of the necromancer. Eventually, curiosity won out, and Burt agreed to give the spell a try. Grinning with satisfaction, Skully taught Burt the incantation, knowing full well that it would have an unexpected effect. Burt, none the wiser, practiced the words under his breath before raising his voice and speaking the incantation with confidence. As the words left his lips, the air around them seemed to shimmer, and a strange, tingling sensation filled the atmosphere. Chapter 2: The Zombie Rabbits. Suddenly, a group of rabbits that had been quietly nibbling on the grass near the edge of the field sprang to life, or rather undeath. They had been transformed into zombie rabbits, their eyes glowing an eerie red and their fur matted with filth. Suddenly, a group of rabbits that had been quietly nibbling on the grass near the edge of the field sprang to life, or rather undeath. They had been transformed into zombie rabbits, their eyes glowing an eerie red and their fur matted with filth. At first, Burt didn't notice anything unusual about the rabbits. One of them approached and began nibbling at his shoe, and Burt chuckled, thinking it was a cute display of curiosity. "Aw, ain't you just the cutest little thing?" he cooed, briefly distracted from the disastrous result of the spell. Soon, however, a second rabbit joined in, then a third, and a fourth, all biting at his shoe with growing enthusiasm. Burt's laughter faltered as a flicker of concern crossed his face. "Now, hold on a minute there," he muttered, attempting to nudge the rabbits away with his foot. But the zombie rabbits were relentless, and their numbers kept growing. As a fifth and sixth rabbit latched onto his shoe, Burt's concern transformed into genuine alarm. "Skully," he shouted, starting to panic. "I think we got a problem here." The rabbits' frenzied biting intensified, and Burt realized that they weren't just playfully nibbling at his shoe, they were trying to tear it apart. Fear crept into his heart as the implications of the situation became clear. Desperate to escape the ravenous horde, Burt kicked his leg free of the rabbits and sprinted away from the field, calling out to Skully for help. Meanwhile, the undead rabbits, far from docile, lunged and hopped about with frenzied energy, attacking anything in their path. Skully, smirking as he watched Burt's panicked efforts from a safe distance, couldn't help but find the entire situation amusing. As Burt stumbled and struggled with the zombie rabbits, Skully snickered. "Aren't they adorable, Burt? Little fluffy bunnies, and you're running scared like they're fire-breathing dragons." Despite his condescending remarks, Skully understood that allowing the zombie rabbits to run amok could have serious consequences. He begrudgingly agreed to help Burt, but not without making it clear that it was Burt's mess they were cleaning up. "Fine. We must find a way to contain your mess before it draws unwanted attention." As they got to work, Burt used whatever he could find to create makeshift barriers, planks of wood, farming equipment, and even old clothing. Skully directed him with his vast knowledge of magical containment, all while making snide comments about Burt's ineptitude. Meanwhile, the zombie rabbits continued to hop and gnash their teeth with reckless abandon. Burt, driven by a mix of fear and determination, tried his best to herd the frenetic undead rabbits towards the designated containment area. However, the rabbits were both fast and surprisingly cunning, evading Burt's efforts with ease. Skully couldn't help but laugh at the sight of the burly farmer chasing after the tiny creatures. "You know, Burt, I've never seen anyone so thoroughly outwitted by a group of rabbits," Skully taunted. Burt, sweating and panting, shot back, "If you're so clever, why don't you come down here and help me catch 'em, Skully?" But Skully remained focused on directing the containment efforts from above. "My talents lie in magical matters, not chasing rabbits," he replied, brushing off Burt's challenge. "Now, less talking and more herding, Burt." The duo continued their efforts to round up the zombie rabbits, with Burt desperately trying to corral the creatures while Skully looked on, offering more sarcasm than assistance. Time was of the essence, and they both knew they needed to find a solution quickly before the village or the Inquisition discovered the infestation. Burt and Skully pressed on, the weight of their task increasing with each passing moment. Burt frantically chased the relentless zombie rabbits, darting in and out of the makeshift barriers, trying to corral them. Sweat poured from his brow, his breaths ragged and heavy, as the small creatures evaded him at every turn. Skully, amused by the spectacle, floated above, mocking Burt's desperate attempts. "Your skills as a rabbit herder are truly unmatched," he snickered, his tone oozing sarcasm. "Perhaps we can enter you in the village's next pet show." In a moment of clarity, Burt thought of a new strategy. He grabbed a handful of fresh vegetables from his garden, hoping to use them as bait. But the zombie rabbits, now driven by their insatiable hunger for living flesh, paid no attention to the once tempting morsels. The situation grew more dire as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field. Both Burt and Skully knew that they needed to act fast before the villagers noticed the chaos. Or worse, the Inquisition caught wind of their undead problem. As Burt panted, he shouted up to Skully, "You got any better ideas, Mr. Necromancer? We ain't making any progress like this." Skully, who had been thoroughly entertained by Burt's futile efforts, begrudgingly floated down to his level. "It seems we have no choice but to resort to more creative measures," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. The necromancer's eyes glowed a sinister purple as he extended his bony hands toward the frenzied zombie rabbits. With a few muttered incantations and arcane gestures, he attempted to exert control over the creatures, hoping to bend them to his will. Slowly, the rabbits began to succumb to Skully's influence, their chaotic movements growing more organized. However, it soon became apparent that Skully could not control all of them at once. He hissed in frustration as he focused on just a portion of the undead horde. Burt, seizing the opportunity, resumed his herding efforts, now aided by Skully's begrudging magical assistance. Together, they started to make progress, the containment area filling with zombie rabbits. But they were acutely aware that every second mattered, the risk of being discovered growing greater by the moment. Burt and Skully pressed on, the weight of their task increasing with each passing moment. Burt frantically chased the relentless zombie rabbits, darting in and out of the makeshift barriers, trying to corral them. Sweat poured from his brow, his breaths ragged and heavy, as the small creatures evaded him at every turn. Skully, amused by the spectacle, floated above, mocking Burt's desperate attempts. "Your skills as a rabbit herder are truly unmatched," he snickered, his tone oozing sarcasm. "Perhaps we can enter you in the village's next pet show." In a moment of clarity, Burt thought of a new strategy. He grabbed a handful of fresh vegetables from his garden, hoping to use them as bait. But the zombie rabbits, now driven by their insatiable hunger for living flesh, paid no attention to the once tempting morsels. The situation grew more dire as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field. Both Burt and Skully knew that they needed to act fast before the villagers noticed the chaos, or worse, the Inquisition caught wind of their undead problem. As Burt panted, he shouted up to Skully, "You got any better ideas, Mr. Necromancer? We ain't making any progress like this." Skully, who had been thoroughly entertained by Burt's futile efforts, begrudgingly floated down to his level. "It seems we have no choice but to resort to more creative measures," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. The necromancer's eyes glowed a sinister purple as he extended his bony hands toward the frenzied zombie rabbits. With a few muttered incantations and arcane gestures, he attempted to exert control over the creatures, hoping to bend them to his will. Slowly, the rabbits began to succumb to Skully's influence, their chaotic movements growing more organized. However, it soon became apparent that Skully could not control all of them at once. He hissed in frustration as he focused on just a portion of the undead horde. Burt, seizing the opportunity, resumed his herding efforts, now aided by Skully's begrudging magical assistance. Together, they started to make progress, the containment area filling with zombie rabbits. But they were acutely aware that every second mattered, the risk of being discovered growing greater by the moment. As Burt and Skully continued their attempts to contain the undead rabbits, a sudden rustling in the bushes caught their attention. To their horror, a group of regular rabbits, attracted by the commotion, had bounded into the field. The zombie rabbits quickly took notice, and in a horrifying instant, they lunged towards their living counterparts. "Skully!" Burt yelled, panic clear in his voice. "We gotta do something, or these zombie rabbits are gonna turn every other rabbit around into undead monsters." Skully, despite his disdain for Burt's concern, recognized the gravity of the situation. If the zombie rabbits were to spread their undead curse, not only would the Inquisition be drawn to the village, but they might also lose any chance of restoring the rabbits to their natural state. "Fine," Skully snapped. "We must act quickly, Burt. I will try to contain the zombie rabbits in a magical barrier. You will need to deal with the uninfected rabbits before they fall victim to the undead." Skully quickly chanted an incantation and moved his hands in intricate patterns, conjuring a mystical barrier around the undead rabbits. The creatures slammed against the glowing purple walls, their eerie red eyes focused on the living rabbits outside. Burt, seizing the moment, leapt into action. Grabbing a large sack, he rushed to round up the uninfected rabbits. It wasn't an easy task, as the creatures panicked and scattered, but Burt was determined to save them. His heart raced, his desperation fueled by the knowledge that each moment they wasted could bring the Inquisition one step closer. With Skully maintaining the barrier and Burt scooping up the uninfected rabbits, the duo worked feverishly to bring the situation under control. But just as Burt caught the last uninfected rabbit and closed the sack, the ground began to shake, and a rumbling thunder echoed in the distance. A cold sweat broke out on Burt's brow as he realized the implication of the sudden disturbance. "Skully, do you hear that?" he stammered, fear tightening his voice. Skully's eyes widened as he recognized the sound. The Inquisition. They must have sensed the undead energy. "We need to dispose of these zombie rabbits immediately, or face their wrath." With time running out and the Inquisition closing in, Burt and Skully knew they had to act fast. The stakes were higher than ever before, and failure could mean not only the destruction of the village, but also the end of their partnership and any chance of achieving Skully's dark ambitions. As the situation grew increasingly dire, Burt and Skully noticed that the zombie rabbits were not only attacking their living counterparts, but also other animals in the vicinity. The two watched in horror as a hapless cow, grazing nearby, suddenly became the target of a swarm of undead rabbits. The cow struggled and moaned, but it wasn't long before the creature fell and rose again, its eyes glowing red as it joined the ranks of the undead. Skully and Burt exchanged a worried glance. "This is worse than we thought," Burt murmured. "Now we've got zombie cows on our hands too. What's next? Zombie sheep, zombie pigs?" "Don't give them any ideas," Skully snapped, his condescending tone only slightly masking his own concern. "We must find a way to stop this undead plague before it spirals even further out of control." The duo hurriedly worked to contain the growing threat. Skully focused on maintaining the magical barrier around the zombie rabbits, while Burt tried his best to corral the uninfected animals and keep them away from the undead horde. As they struggled to bring the situation under control, Burt and Skully saw the terrifying ripple effect of the zombie rabbits' attacks. Soon, a small army of undead creatures roamed the fields: zombie cows, zombie sheep, zombie pigs, zombie bears, zombie deer, zombie owls, zombie bivoxes, and even zombie badgers. The frenzied undead animals wreaked havoc on the countryside, threatening not just the villagers, but also the balance of the ecosystem itself. With the Inquisition closing in and the situation more chaotic than ever, Skully and Burt knew they had to act fast. The stakes were higher than ever before, and failure could mean not only the destruction of the village, but also the end of their partnership and any chance of achieving Skully's dark ambitions. "We need a plan, Skully," Burt shouted over the cacophony of snarls, growls, and moans from the undead animals. "We can't keep this up much longer." Skully, gritting his teeth, racked his ancient mind for a solution. Time was running out, and they needed a miracle to save the village and themselves from the impending doom. As the two continued their attempts to contain the mayhem, Skully threw a sarcastic jab at Burt. "You know, Burt, I didn't realize that you had a secret talent for creating apocalyptic scenarios." Burt, catching a zombie squirrel and tossing it into a makeshift pen, retorted with his usual down-to-earth wit. "Well, Skully, not all of us can be as refined and cultured as a talking skull. I do the best I can with what I got." Skully scoffed. "Oh, come on. Burr, your best is unleashing an army of undead animals onto your unsuspecting neighbors. I shudder to think of what your worst could be," Burt grumbled as he chased down a zombified raccoon. "You ain't exactly helping, you know. A little less talk and a bit more action from you might make this go quicker." "Well, I apologize for not having legs," Skully replied with mock indignation. "But I assure you, I'm contributing with my superior intellect." As they bickered back and forth, Burt and Skully continued to deal with the undead menagerie, their banter serving as a bizarre soundtrack to the unfolding chaos. Despite their differing personalities and the constant barbs, The two managed to work together to tackle the growing threat. Burt lunged for a zombie rabbit, narrowly missing as it hopped out of his grasp. He couldn't help but let out a frustrated groan. Skully chuckled. "You really have a way with animals, don't you, Burt? A regular animal charmer." "Animal charmer? Ha! I wish I could just charm these critters into behaving," Burt said, wiping sweat from his brow as he looked around for the next creature to capture. Skully sighed. "Yes, it's a shame your animal magnetism doesn't extend to the undead variety." Burt managed to snatch a zombified fox by its tail, then carried it at arm's length to the pen. "Look here, Skully, I got us a fox. You ever seen a zombified fox before? I reckon that's something new for both of us." Skully, unimpressed. "So, how marvelous, Burt. A new addition to our horrifying collection. I'm absolutely thrilled." Their back and forth continued as they progressed through the chaos. Burt's persistence and determination were a striking contrast to Skully's sarcasm and negativity. Despite their differences, they worked together to try and contain the nightmarish situation they had found themselves in. With the zombie animals multiplying, the duo's task was growing increasingly daunting. Burt and Skully knew that they needed a more efficient method of containment, or else the village and the Inquisition would surely discover the infestation. As Burt wrangled a zombified sheep, Skully finally suggested, "Perhaps we need a different approach. Maybe there's a spell that could help us deal with this calamity more effectively." Burt nodded, panting from his exertions. "Got any ideas in that old bony noggin of yours?" Skully smirked. "I may have a few tricks up my non-existent sleeves. Just keep an eye on these creatures while I search my vast knowledge for a solution." And so, as Burt continued to chase and capture the undead animals, Skully dove deep into his arcane memory, seeking a spell or incantation that could help them stem the tide of zombified wildlife. Skully floated above the chaos, concentrating as he mentally leafed through the countless spells and incantations stored within his ancient memory. Meanwhile, Burt, covered in dirt and sweat, managed to capture a zombified deer, barely avoiding its snapping jaws. Finally, Skully's eyes lit up with recognition. "Aha! I've got it. There's a spell that should force the zombie creatures to congregate in one location." Burt, who had just caught a zombified bear, looked over at Skully. "Well, don't keep me in suspense. How do we do it?" Skully floated down next to Burt, explaining the incantation. "Repeat after me, mortuorum congregari." Burt furrowed his brow and repeated the words, "mortuorum congregari." As soon as Burt finished the incantation, the undead animals began to shuffle and hop towards a central point. The zombified creatures appeared to be drawn to the spot, as if pulled by an invisible force. "By the harvest gods, it's working!" Burt exclaimed, both excited and relieved. Skully nodded, a hint of smugness in his voice. "Of course it is. Never doubt the power of an ancient necromancer's knowledge." The undead animals continued to gather at the designated point, forming a writhing, chaotic mass of fur and feathers. Burt looked on, trying to think of what to do next. "So now that we've got them all in one spot, what's the plan? How do we undo the zombification?" Burt and Skully stood before the mass of undead animals, the creatures writhing and clashing in the designated containment area. Skully, a grin on his bony face, looked at the chaos with a gleeful expression. "Burt, behold, look at the potential of our new undead army. We could use them to conquer and spread our influence." Burt, horrified by the suggestion, shook his head vehemently. "No, Skully, that's a terrible idea. We can't let these creatures hurt anyone else. We have to put an end to this, not use them for our own gain." Skully rolled his eye sockets. clearly annoyed by Burt's reluctance. Burt. Why did we go through all of this trouble if we can't even get a little undead army out of it now? Everything under control. Think about it. With this army, we could achieve our goals much more easily. Burt crossed his arms, looking sternly at Skully. What happened to you wanting to regain your lost powers, Skully? Do you really think building an undead army is the best way to do that? Skully snorted. Burt sighed, rubbing his temples. Skully, we didn't do this to create an army. We did this to fix my mistake and protect the people of this land. Now, we need to find a way to dispel the magic and save these creatures from their nightmarish existence. Skully glared at Burt, unwilling to give up his dream of having an undead army so easily. You're so short-sighted, Burt. These creatures could have been invaluable to us. We'd have the advantage in any conflict. But at what cost, Skully? Burt argued back. We'd be responsible for the suffering and fear they'd cause. I won't be a part of that. Now help me find a way to undo this mess. Skully tilted his skull, genuinely puzzled by Burt's concern. Suffering and fear. Burt, you're speaking as if those are problems. If anything, they're useful tools. They can help us assert control and bend others to our will. Burt looked at Skully, his face a mix of disbelief and exasperation. You can't be serious, Skully. I'm not going to become a tyrant or spread pain just to further your ambitions. I won't let you use these creatures like that. Skully rolled his eye sockets, still not comprehending Burt's moral stance. Fine, if it bothers you so much, we'll find a way to undo this mess. But I still think you're missing out on a great opportunity for power. As Skully delved into his arcane memory, searching for a spell to dispel the necromantic energy animating the creatures, Burt stood his ground, determined to set things right and ensure the safety of the people and animals affected by their actions. The pair toiled through the night as the moon rose high and bathed the farm in a soft, pale glow. Skully, his eye sockets aglow with an eerie blue light, was engrossed in the necromantic tome. He mumbled ancient phrases and muttered about the complexities of the spell, seemingly oblivious to Burt's growing impatience. Burt, on the other hand, had his hands full trying to prevent the ever-growing horde of undead animals from causing any more havoc. He had constructed makeshift fences and traps around the farm, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to manage the situation. Skully, Burt grumbled, trying to keep a charging undead pig at bay. You better be close to finding a solution. Skully, still engrossed in the book, didn't look up. Patience, Burt. Necromantic reversal isn't as simple as making a stew. It takes precision, understanding, and a delicate touch. With a frustrated groan, Burt shoved the pig away. Well, you better find that delicate touch soon, because I'm running out of fences. Suddenly, Skully's eye sockets brightened, a spark of triumph dancing within them. Ah, here we are, he exclaimed, pointing a bony finger at a page in the book. A reversal spell. It's complex and will require both of us to work in tandem, but it should do the trick. Despite his frustration, Burt couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. He looked at Skully, determination set in his features. Well then, let's get to it. I'm not going to let these poor creatures suffer any longer. Together, they began the arduous process of preparing for the spell. Burt gathered the necessary materials, a collection of herbs and roots, a drop of his own blood, and a piece of bone from one of the undead creatures, while Skully meticulously marked out the arcane symbols around the farm, his bony finger leaving a trail of glowing blue energy in the dirt. As Burt returned with the materials, Skully looked up from his work, the eerie glow from his eyes illuminating the dark night. "Are you ready, Burt?" he asked, a hint of curiosity in his voice. "This will not be easy, and it will require both our efforts." Burt swallowed hard, looking at the undead animals that were still wreaking havoc across his farm. He remembered his old life, the simplicity of it, and for a moment he wished he could return to it. But he knew that wasn't possible, not anymore. He had a responsibility now, one he had chosen himself. "I'm ready," he said, looking Skully straight in the eyes. With that, they began. Skully started chanting in an ancient guttural language, the air around them crackling with energy as the spell took effect. Burt, following Skully's instructions, crushed the herbs and roots, added his blood, and tossed the mixture into the arcane circle. A column of blue energy exploded upwards, illuminating the night sky. The animals stopped their destruction, suddenly entranced by the display of magic. One by one, they turned towards the energy, their red eyes glowing ominously in the dark. The energy pulsed, and with each pulse, the glow in the eyes of the undead animals dimmed. After what felt like an eternity, the final pulse spread outwards, a wave of energy washing over the farm. As the light faded, Burt and Skully looked around. The undead animals had returned to their lifeless state, their bodies strewn across the farm. The farm was once again quiet, the only sound being the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. Burt let out a sigh of relief, his body sagging with exhaustion. They had done it. They had reversed the spell. As he looked over at Skully, he saw the skull grinning back at him, a sense of satisfaction in its glowing eyes. "Well done, Burt," Skully said, floating over to him. "You've proven yourself once again. You might make a decent necromancer yet." Burt snorted, shaking his head as he looked around at the now peaceful farm. "Nah," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "I think I'll stick to farming. Seems a bit less chaotic." Skully simply laughed, the sound echoing eerily in the quiet night. As they set about cleaning up the farm, Burt couldn't help but think about what the future held. He knew it wouldn't be simple, and it certainly wouldn't be quiet. But with Skully by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. After all, he was no longer just Burt the farmer. He was Burt, the reluctant necromancer. Cleaning up the aftermath of the undead infestation was no small task. With the light of the rising sun, the farm revealed a landscape of destruction. Fields were torn apart, fences destroyed, and the bodies of lifeless animals littered the area. Burt, despite his weariness, knew that the cleanup couldn't wait. "Burt, you've got to be kidding me." Skully floated over the wreckage, his glowing eyes wide with disbelief. "This is worse, this is the race than I expected." "Tell me about it," Burt grumbled, hauling a lifeless cow off his trampled carrot patch. "Look at this mess." "It's not all bad, Burt," Skully said, looking thoughtful. "At least the Inquisition didn't show up." "Small favors," Burt muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "But I doubt we'll be so lucky next time." As the day wore on, the pair continued their work. Burt, with his sturdy farmer strength, handled the heavy lifting, while Skully, despite his lack of physical form, proved surprisingly useful. His magical abilities came in handy for rebuilding fences and corralling the unaffected farm animals. By nightfall, they had managed to restore some semblance of order to the farm. They sat on the porch, Skully floating beside Burt's chair, both looking out over the battered fields. The farm still bore the scars of the undead infestation, but it was a start. "You know, Burt," Skully started, his voice dripping with his usual sarcasm, "for a mortal with limited intellectual capacity, you do have a peculiar knack for survival." Burt looked at the skull, raising an eyebrow. "Don't flatter yourself," Skully retorted quickly. "I'm merely stating a fact, not praising your—" Burt chuckled, rolling his eyes at Skully's comment. "Well, I'll take what I can get." They lapsed into a comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the night sky. Despite the chaos and destruction of the day, the farm was still standing and they had averted a potential disaster. As Burt looked out over his land, he felt a strange sense of contentment. Yes, his life was far from ordinary, and yes, it was more chaotic than he could have ever imagined. But it was his life, and he wouldn't trade it for anything, even if it meant dealing with a sarcastic skull.